Ladies and gentlemen, undoubtedly you've heard by now that Ernie Mills passed away on February 26, 2003. Vietnam veterans were especially important to Ernie. This is a show he taped in August of 1999 at the Vietnam Veterans National Memorial in Angel Fire, New Mexico, the first national memorial to Vietnam veterans in the country.
I'm Ernie Mills. This is Report from Santa Fe. Today, from the Vietnam Memorial at Angel Fire, New Mexico, our guest, one of the most beloved men I know in the United States, Dr. Victor Westphall. Victor, it's good to be back again.
It's good to have you, Ernie. I'm sure that we'll have a good production as we have in the past.
Victor, I would like to go back. It's been 31 years ago, and I was thinking this week, I went to Vietnam as a correspondent. It was in February of 1968. In May of 1968, your son, Victor Westphall III, was shot and killed by a sniper in Vietnam. You came back then with it. You had a dream. What was your dream then?
David was killed in Vietnam in an ambush on May 22nd, 1968. And he had insurance money that he left at the time. We didn't want to use it for any ordinary things such as scholarships. My wife thought of the idea of the Vietnam Veterans Peace and Brotherhood Chapel. And in the parlance of the times, I grabbed that idea like a dog wearing a bone and carried on from there.
We're looking back. Are you surprised? Did your dream turn out the way you wanted?
Of course, one on short notice like that can't anticipate exactly what's going to happen. But at no time did I think of it in terms of being a local area or just a memorial to our son, but rather I was thinking in terms of a gift to humanity.
In 1969, I had come back from the second tour of Vietnam, and I was amazed at what was happening to the young men who served there. You know, there was a lot of rife in the country at the time, and the result of that was that the Vietnam Memorial, which was one of its first in the nation, in my memory, this suddenly blossomed as a place for all Vietnam veterans to come. They look almost upon this as their home, but it was so valuable at the time because it was bonding for them. Did you anticipate that?
By and large, Vietnam veterans didn't get a very good welcome when they came home. And so it was most important and timely that I started the Memorial Chapel in 1968, the year of the Tet Offensive, the bloodiest year of the war, because Vietnam veterans realized then that if at least here somebody cared. If by and large throughout the nation there wasn't a very good feeling toward them, here there was a different situation. They were very much regarded.
You know, when you came up here now, and again, it's almost like fate. You had a construction business in Albuquerque. You sold your business, but you came up here and you bought property, the property upon which the memorial now sits. That was in 1966. That's almost as if fate decreed what you were going to do.
I was in the building business in Albuquerque, and as you say, I spent 3 years trying to dissolve that building business, liquidate it so that I could devote full time to writing history. And I suddenly came upon the idea of coming up here and purchasing Valverde Ranch, which was an 800-acre ranch for a mountain subdivision. And it really didn't make any sense at all. Coming up here in 1966, in 1968, I found out why I was here when our son was killed, and I was called upon to start the Vietnam Veterans Peace and Brotherhood Chapel, which, by the way, is the first memorial to Vietnam veterans anywhere.
The first anywhere.
Anywhere.
And I found when I went back to Washington, I had Vietnam veterans back there when they put the wall up. And they told me, they said the wall was live, and it's lovely. And they said, but if it hadn't been for Dr. Westphall's memorial in New Mexico. They didn't know whether or not they would make it. I have found, when we talk about dreams, you had a number of dreams that, even surrounding the time when young Victor had been killed, that seemed to tell you what was happening over there. Can you relate a couple of those for us?
It was very timely that these occurrences, dreams, visions, call it what you may, but one of the most unusual, at a certain time and place, I decided that there would be 13 photos in the chapel. The cross inside would be 13 feet high. That we would fly the 13-star flag, which is the first original flag of our nation. I was born on October 13th, 1913, and all of these 13s I finally found a year and a half later that there were 13 in the company killed in which David lost his life. It seems to be an extraordinary coincidence, far more than coincidence.
Well, I had, and again, these stories turn up every day. There's another story. I sat here one day meditating outside the chapel, and a man came up to me and said, are you from New Mexico? I said, yes. And he said, do you know a fellow named Richard Roca? And I said, very well, Congressional Medal of Honor recipient. And he said, I don't know how much you know about him. I said, well, I know why he won the medal, but I never, got the full details. He said, I'm the man that Richard Roca pulled out of a helicopter.
Right.
He said, I looked up and he said, there was no way that I could survive. And he said, here was this madman standing on the side of the chopper. He said, you could almost see the tracer bullets going over his head. He pulled out the co-pilot who was killed and he said, saved my life. You had this happen recently, I think just a few days before we did this video. You talked to the man who had brought back Victor's body from Vietnam. And in all these years, you had never met him, had you?
Just 2-3 days ago, day before yesterday, as a matter of fact, David Bilbray from a small town in Kansas paid me a visit. He was the pilot of the helicopter who was sent to bring back the dead and wounded after the ambush at Con Thien. And he was on a resupply mission to Khe Sanh from Dang Ha. On the way back from Khe Sanh, he was instructed by radio to go and pick up the dead and wounded at Khe Sanh, at Con Thien, which included my son. And it was a very emotional moment for both of us, of course, particularly for him. And he had his wife and family along, and they consoled him very nicely.
That area I am familiar with, because I'd flown into Dang Ha, and sure enough, at that, which most desolate place in the world, there was a fellow from New Mexico, P.D. Menace, was stationed there. And of course, moved over to the landing pad where they picked you up to take you into Khe Sanh, and there was another young man named Marine Joe Cedillo, who has since passed away. But the Mexicans were marvelous. I think we've said the figures frequently. 1 out of 8 people who served in Vietnam saw combat. 1 out of 3 New Mexicans saw combat over there. Did you do the design for the chapel yourself, for the Vietnam Memorial?
You ask if I did the design for the chapel. No. A young architect by the name of Ted Luna at the time was brought together by a mutual acquaintance. And he designed the chapel. And my only charge to him was that anyone entering must not be able to leave feeling exactly as they had before about peace and war. So he came up with all these soft, gentle curves, which from a design standpoint is the epitome of peace, and therefore properly the Vietnam Veterans Peace and Brotherhood Chapel. When
I went back in my memory, going back to Washington, and then having people come to me and say, Ernie, you know Dr. Westphall. When you go back to New Mexico, give him my very best. So I suddenly realized that this young contractor, Victor Westphall from New Mexico, was known all over the country, talking to people like Colonel Hackworth, you know, probably the most decorated soldier that we've ever had in this country. He asked, how's Victor Westphall doing? We looked at that period, and then your dream expanded. And we were looking at the dreams when you started, and then taking it up to a period about almost the present. Bring us up to date on what people should know about it, because it's still, as you mentioned to me, people come in here, you never hear loud noises. It is one, you know, people are enthralled with what you put together here.
People come here and they repeatedly say that they sense something that they can't put their finger on. And actually, this has been, since prehistory, a sacred place for the Aboriginal people, the Native Americans here. About 5 miles north of here is a rock outcrop. Out of it, struggling to survive, is a single pine tree. How old it is hard to say without taking tree ring evidence from it. But that was a shrine, an altar for the Taos Pueblo Indians when they used to come down here from Blue Lake, which is a sacred lake of the Taos Pueblo people. They used to put cornmeal in natural native niches in the rock, just from the weathering from the rock. And of course, it was acquired by the birds, but it served their purpose, or their philosophy, their religion of going back to Mother Earth.
Victor, you went back to Vietnam, to Con Thien. And am I correct that you took some of the dirt from this site and mixed it with the dirt over there, and then took some of the dirt from there to bring it back to this enchanted area here?
Yes, that's correct. And then actually, the purpose of the visit was to visit the ambush site where our son was killed. And one of the things we thought would be just kind of a proper thing to do was to take soil from Angel Fire, which is the actual site where the memorial is, to Con Thien in Vietnam, and acquire soil there and bring it back. Oddly enough, we took soil from Angel Fire to Con Thien. Con Thien is Vietnamese for Hill of the Angels, so we took soil from the Angel Fire to the Hill of the Angels and back.
We're back to the present, an important time. What are your dreams for the future now? You're a man that has dreamed for the 30 years that I've known you well. What are your dreams now? What would you like to see happen?
Well, I don't believe it's so much a matter of what I'd like to see as what seems to be dictated by circumstance. In November of last year, the Disabled American Veterans, the DAV, made a magnificent bequest to the David Westphall Veterans Foundation, the entire memorial complex. And if we accepted that gift, we knew full well that we would have to raise substantial amounts of money to perpetuate it. And that is a challenge and a promise. The challenge is to do it. The promise is that I think that people in the nation will respond to help us acquire that funding to perpetuate the memorial and to perpetuate that dream.
The foundation, now that's new.
Yes.
And it's national in scope.
Right.
And you, when I talked to you earlier about it, you seemed surprised at the response to the foundation. People, I'd say, coming out of the woodwork, more or less, and saying, no, I want to be part of this.
Yes, that is very true. And to give you some indication, the attendance at the memorial at the visitor center has increased markedly. I think it's probably to an extent because we have gotten the word around that we need help, that we need support. The same thing with contributions have markedly increased, I think because of the same reason that the general public realizes that we need help and they're helping.
I noticed, and this was an addition to it, but I believe it's a Huey helicopter that now has been brought up and part of the property. Who had that idea? And it's marvelous.
Well, the Huey came from the National Guard in Santa Fe. They supplied it and repaired it. I want to tell you a little story about that later, and brought it up, helped them set it up. One of the unusual things about it, we made contact with one of the pilots who flew it in Vietnam. He's Larry McDonald of Florida. And on one mission, he had to lay down a smoke screen to facilitate evacuation of the wounded. And he had to take 7 passes to get this smoke screen laid down because the wind was blowing. And accordingly, he was under intense fire enemy fire for all 7 passes. There were 132 bullet holes in that Huey that we have out here. And
how many bullet holes?
132. And Larry McDonald received the Silver Star and the Purple Heart for this particular mission. We have a complete history of the Huey, and that was what I just told you is one of the most startling things about its history, but there are other equally unique events surrounding it. We're also planning on getting a Cobra helicopter, which is a gunship, to guard our Huey, because in Vietnam it was customary in case of a medevac mission with a Huey to accompany it with a Cobra gunship to protect it on the way back to the hospital.
And we used to ride with the legs hanging out of the Cobras, right. And as they would just fly around the Hueys, and marvelous, marvelous area. Have you been surprised in recent years with, I see no lack of interest in the memorials. You said, I would imagine in the next year or so, you see almost a doubling of the number of visitors here.
I think you're totally right. I think that we're on a ride right now. That we're on just a roller coaster heading for really positive things in connection with the memorial, and I just don't know where it's going to go. But except I know it's going to go far and wide. And
what are your favorite stories from the people? We all have them. People I've talked to here that have bumped into people they haven't seen in ages. As you say, I stopped in earlier to, you have a video here that not only goes back to Vietnam, but it's historical. Visitors love to stop here and bring their youngsters, and in better words than they could describe, because most of these men were very inward. People didn't always want to listen to them. It was very important. And so the video here, we have the sound in the background. People will sit there and they're so quiet, almost in awe. But it's interesting watching the youngsters who are here thinking about, that's what my father did.
Right.
And that's what my grandfather did. What were your favorite stories of some of the people you've met?
I repeatedly say to visitors, take back good memories, tell people about us. And I find out that is precisely what they do in great numbers. And that is our best means of advertising, is people telling people. And when that process becomes exponential, then everything breaks loose, and there really is a marked increase in all of the things you're trying to do. And I feel, you can't really put a finger on it, but I feel that we are about reaching that point where the situation is becoming exponential. By exponential, I mean 2 and 2 is 4, but you get 2,000 and 2,000 is 4,000. And it increases in that proportion, it becomes very, very important, very significant.
Now, how many of these young men come up here almost insisting on seeing Victor Westphall? I had someone come up and tap me on the shoulder before and said, "Excuse me, are you Dr. Westphall?" I said, "Well, if you're taking a nap, I'll say yes," but I didn't. I was very gracious about that. But a lot of them insist on seeing you personally, don't they? They find they can talk to you.
Right, and it's all right. Wherever I am, taking a nap, regardless, I'm available. And yes, there are quite a few. Some are surprised to learn that I'm still here and still around, and they're pleased, of course. But yes, it is true that they want to, and it is quite unusual that I don't have to introduce myself. By and large, they know who I am.
We've had people that I think New Mexico has been fortunate. This, of course, I see it even as more than just a memorial for the Vietnam veterans. We have veterans from all wars who love to come up here because of the respect shown to servicemen. I think that was helped a lot by General, the National Guard commander here, General Ed Baca.
Right.
And he went back and he took over the role as head of the National Guard Bureau, which at the time was the highest position held by an Hispanic in the nation.
Yeah, that's right.
And if you walked into his office, it was like walking into an office in New Mexico. Many of them get fancy, but his office was New Mexico. There were things there with the Bataan Death March, and you go through that period. You go through the efforts of this country with people like the Jerry Murphy, Congressional Medal of Honor recipient. We had the Hershey Yamamura. These people had come out of the Korean War. Colonel Bob Scott, who recently passed away. Marvelous backgrounds, but they had the same love for this that the Vietnam veterans had
Right.
too.
We have officially we recognize veterans of all wars as attested to by a plaque up on the upper parking lot. We pay special recognition to Vietnam veterans simply because that was the era my son was. But we do officially, as I say, by board action, recognize the veterans of all wars throughout the history of America, from the Revolution through Desert Sand.
What I noticed,
Desert Storm.
you come up here to Desert Storm, Desert Sands, and one of the things that General Baca told me, and I think it was based so much upon what you did here, they said no matter what we look at anymore, when we're discussing wars, the important thing is that we try to pinpoint that no one will ever go through what the young men did coming back from Vietnam again.
Right.
And they made that a point. As he said, I noticed when we had just small groups coming back from the Middle East, they would pick up the phone and say, no, come out with the families. Families would be there to welcome them. They never should come back again and go through what the young men did who went over there. But I noticed this in the plaques you have around here. People have given you credit for making this first overture. That's got to make you feel special.
Well, I think it's important to notice here yes, you're true. You're absolutely right. There are a number of plaques, and there are many more that we don't have room for. But I think it attests to the fact that the people of this nation do recognize the importance of the memorial here. You mentioned Ed Baca, General Baca. He is, by the way, is vice president, new vice president of the board of directors. David King is the president. But one time, General Baca and I were in Washington, D.C., and there was a subway interruption. We had to hike a considerable distance, and on the way, standing on the street was a black man, and when he learned who we were, he rushed out into the middle of the street to stop the traffic.
Oh, isn't it marvelous? That's so touching.
Well, I thought so at the time, and he just literally went out in no intersection and stopped traffic for us to pass, and that was sort of typical of the relations we've had with the American public.
Well, the foundation now, you have a new board of directors for the foundation,
Right.
I believe. And how can, and I think there is no problem with this, how can people get in touch with the foundation who are viewing this show today?
The telephone number at the memorial here is 505-377-6900.
Let me have that one more time.
377-6900.
And that area code is 505.
Right.
And they can call for those who want to make contributions. You accept corporate contributions as well?
Definitely. We seek, we're really going all out for corporate donations right at the present time, because we do need a considerable amount of money and reasonably quickly, and that's one way of acquiring it.
Victor, in the time we have left, you've watched your dream form, you've watched it mature, and now you're looking at the future. What message do you want to leave the audience we have today?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the Vietnam Veterans National Memorial, as we are officially called, under the auspices of the David Westphall Veterans Foundation, is on a roll. We're going places, and we invite the American public to help us do so.
To go with you.
Go with us, or help us.
Right, and I should mention we will have some pictures, views of the chapel, because I had found it very touching when you try to explain to people. Someone will say, "Why did you save those boots?" You say, "Well, I'm saving the boots to let you know what those boots are
Right.
like."
What they've been through.
And you remember the days that we come up here and people, you'd suddenly find people. I found medals in the chapel, Purple Hearts, that were left there by people, fellows who had left their combat boots there. Some of the most precious things to them that they left here to remember others. And that is not, that's still increased, hasn't it? It still happens.
Let me tell you just two instances, very, very personal. One young man, Vietnam veteran, took a bracelet off his wrist that he'd worn ever since Vietnam, and just impetuously handed it to me. He wanted it to go with a memorial. Another one had a piece of currency, Vietnam Army currency, that he'd been carrying for all this length of time, 30 years, and he wanted it to have. Well, there's nothing of particular value, except it was of tremendous value to them, because they had possessed it all these years and valued it highly.
Well, that meant a lot to them, but Victor Westphall, you mean an awful lot to us. Our guest today, Victor Westphall, Dr. Victor Westphall, who is the gentleman who put together, it was his concept, the Vietnam Memorial in Angel Fire, New Mexico. It's a dream that has matured and a dream that will continue. I'm Ernie Mills, and thank you for being with us on Report from Santa Fe.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've been watching a program videotaped in August of 1999 with Ernie Mills and Dr. Victor Westphall. Ernie Mills died on February 26, 2003. Next week, Report from Santa Fe will feature a memorial program about Ernie Mills, its founder.